the secret science behind human survival. At this very moment, 20,000 feet above sea level, Tibetan highlanders are breathing normally while you, or I, would be suffering altitude sickness. Their bodies have physically evolved larger lungs and specialized blood cells that scientists once thought impossible. What if I told you humans have developed superpowers to survive in environments that should kill us? How did these remarkable adaptations come to be? In the next 15 minutes, you'll discover how certain populations can hold their breath underwater for over 10 minutes, survive in minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures with minimal clothing, or extract water from seemingly barren deserts, all through natural adaptations our species has developed over generations. The roof of a world. Life at 16,000 feet. What if your next breath contained 40% less oxygen than you're used to? Welcome to the Tibetan Plateau, a vast elevated region that stretches across 2.5 million square kilometers of Central Asia. Often called the roof of the world, this massive highland sits at an average elevation exceeding 16,000 feet above sea level, making it both the highest and largest plateau on Earth. To put this in perspective, standing on the Tibetan Plateau places you higher than the summit of nearly every mountain in the continental United States. The atmosphere at this altitude contains drastically less oxygen than what most humans experience. At sea level, oxygen makes up about 21% of the air, but the decreased atmospheric pressure at 16,000 feet means each breath delivers far less oxygen to your lungs. This creates potentially deadly conditions for the unprepared. When the typical human body encounters these conditions, it immediately begins to struggle. The first response is hyperventilation. Your breathing rate increases as your body desperately tries to compensate for the oxygen deficit. Your heart races, sometimes exceeding 100 beats per minute even at rest, attempting to circulate the limited oxygen throughout your body. Within hours, symptoms intensify. Splitting headaches develop as oxygen-starved brain tissue begins to swell. Nausea, vomiting, and extreme fatigue make even minor physical tasks exhausting. Cognitive functions deteriorate. Sleep becomes nearly impossible as your breathing pattern grows irregular, often including prolonged pauses that jolt you awake, gasping for air. For some visitors, the situation becomes life-threatening within days. High-altitude pulmonary edema can develop, causing shortness of breath even at rest and a persistent cough producing frothy sputum. Without immediate descent to lower elevation, this condition can be fatal within hours. Yet amid this celestial coliseum where the unprepared falter, a population of over 6 million people thrives. Elderly Tibetan villagers in their 80s and 90s tend to fields at elevations where mountain climbers require supplemental oxygen. Young children play vigorous games, running and laughing. Pregnant women carry babies to term and conditions where lowlanders experience high rates of miscarriage. Tibetan laborers routinely carry heavy loads up steep mountain paths without oxygen distress. The contrast between natives and visitors is stark. Tourists shuffle slowly through markets with oxygen canisters at their side. Local vendors energetically hawk their wares for hours without fatigue. Lowland visitors experience interrupted sleep despite weeks of careful acclimatization and medications. Tibetan hosts sleep soundly and wake refreshed. This represents a profound physiological difference, not merely mental toughness or superior fitness. This harsh environment presents challenges beyond oxygen scarcity. Winter temperatures plummet to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit with fierce winds. Summer nights frequently drop below freezing, creating an extremely brief growing season. UV exposure on the plateau can be 40% higher than at sea level, causing rapid sunburn and increased cancer risk. Water resources are limited, with much of the region receiving less than 10 inches of precipitation annually. These combined challenges create an environment so hostile that Chinese scientists in the 1950s had to rotate personnel every few weeks due to deteriorating health. Yet Tibetan communities have continuously occupied these highlands for thousands of years, developing a perfectly calibrated way of life. Medical imaging reveals part of this remarkable adaptation. Tibetans typically have broader chests and enhanced diaphragm strength, allowing them to take in more air with each breath. Their breathing pattern is deeper and more efficient, extracting maximum oxygen from the thin air. The most puzzling aspect emerges when measuring blood oxygen levels. Despite identical environmental conditions, Tibetans maintain oxygen saturation levels of 85 to 90%, while visitors often drop below 80% even after weeks of acclimatization. The typical human response to high altitude involves producing more red blood cells to transport oxygen. Most visitors show dramatically increased hematocrit levels, sometimes exceeding 60% compared to the normal 45%. This compensatory response creates a dangerous side effect. Blood becomes thicker and more viscous, flowing more slowly and increasing the risk of clots. The risk of stroke, heart attack, and pulmonary embolism rises significantly, particularly during pregnancy. Here, Tibetan physiology demonstrates its most remarkable feature. Blood tests consistently show that Tibetans maintain normal or even lower than expected red blood cell counts despite the oxygen-poor environment. Their blood remains thin and flows freely, eliminating dangerous side effects while somehow maintaining adequate tissue oxygenation. Research revealed another adaptation. Nitric oxide levels in Tibetan subjects appeared in concentrations approximately 10 times higher than in lowlanders. This molecule causes blood vessels to dilate, allowing blood to reach peripheral tissues more efficiently without requiring dangerous increases in blood viscosity. For decades, these findings puzzled medical researchers. Every physiological principle suggested these people should suffer from chronic hypoxia, oxygen starvation, yet they showed none of the expected signs. Their bodies maintained normal function with oxygen levels that would trigger serious medical interventions in any hospital. Even more confounding, they accomplished this without the compensatory mechanisms observed in every other human population studied at altitude. What invisible adaptation allowed Tibetans to settle permanently in an environment that remains hostile to everyone else? The answer would ultimately be found in their genetic code, in a story of inheritance that stretches back to an extinct human species and an evolutionary process that worked at unprecedented speed. Genetic time capsule, the Denisovan connection. The answer to the Tibetan altitude mystery was hiding not in their physiology, but in their DNA, a 40,000-year-old genetic gift from a species of humans most people have never heard of. While researchers expected to find gradual adaptations accumulated over countless generations, what they discovered instead rewrote our understanding of human evolution. When scientists first began investigating the Tibetan high-altitude adaptation, they faced a perplexing timeline problem. Most significant evolutionary adaptations require tens or even hundreds of thousands of years to develop within a population. Yet archaeological evidence showed humans had only inhabited the Tibetan Plateau permanently for approximately 3,000 to 4,000 years. How could such profound physiological differences emerge in what amounts to a genetic blink of an eye? The first breakthrough came in 2010 when researchers identified that Tibetans possessed a unique variant of a gene called EPS1. This gene, sometimes called the super athlete gene, plays a crucial role in how the body responds to low oxygen environments. The variant found in Tibetans contained a complex pattern of mutations that appeared nowhere else in the modern human genome. Then in 2014, a team led by researchers from the University of California, Berkeley made an astonishing discovery. They compared the Tibetan EPS1 variant against genetic material available from extinct human species. The results stunned the scientific community. The closest match wasn't found in any modern humans, but in genetic material extracted from a 40,000-year-old finger bone discovered in a remote Siberian cave. That finger bone belonged to a member of a previously unknown human species that scientists named Denisovans, after the Denisova cave where the remains were found. Unlike Neanderthals, whose skeletal remains have been found across Europe and Asia, almost everything we know about Denisovans comes from DNA extracted from that single finger bone, a few teeth, and a jawbone fragment discovered years later in a Tibetan cave. This is a really clear-cut case where admixture with an extinct population has benefited a modern population, explained Rasmus Nielsen, who led the 2014 study. Without modern genetic sequencing technology, we would never have known the Denisovans existed at all, much less their crucial contribution to human adaptation. How did Denisovan DNA end up in the Tibetan genome? The evidence points to interbreeding between early modern humans and Denisovans sometime between 40,000 and 60,000 years ago, as our ancestors migrated across Asia. Genetic evidence suggests multiple instances of interbreeding with both Denisovans and Neanderthals in human prehistory. Initially, this genetic transfer would have been just one of many variations in the early human gene pool, conferring no immediate advantage to those living at lower elevations. The real evolutionary story began when human groups moved upward to the Tibetan Plateau. Suddenly, individuals carrying this Denisovan genetic variant had a tremendous survival advantage in the oxygen-scarce environment. The scientific detective work required to uncover this story represents one of the most fascinating examples of genetic archaeology. Researchers compared DNA sequences of modern Tibetans with neighboring populations, identifying segments that showed signs of strong natural selection, regions where a specific variant had spread rapidly. The EPS1 region stood out dramatically, showing signs of what geneticists call a selective sweep, where a beneficial mutation spreads quickly. The pattern was so extreme that it indicated one of the strongest cases of natural selection ever documented in humans. Within approximately 3,000 years, roughly 120 generations, this genetic variant went from being present in a small percentage of the population to nearly universal among Tibetans. The Denisovan version of EPS1 contains a cluster of mutations spanning approximately 32,700 base pairs of DNA, a complex sequence that would be extremely unlikely to arise independently through random mutation. It's difficult to come up with a scenario where you could get the same 32,700 mutations to occur randomly by chance, explained Nielsen. This discovery fundamentally alters how we view human evolution, suggesting that interbreeding between different human species provided crucial genetic material that allowed our species to adapt to extreme environments. Like an ancient key unlocking a door to survival, this inherited genetic code enabled humans to thrive where others could not. The EPS1 gene serves as a master regulator for the body's response to hypoxia, low oxygen conditions. When oxygen levels drop, the gene typically signals for increased production of red blood cells. While this helps in short-term adaptation, chronically elevated red blood cell levels lead to dangerous blood thickening in non-adapted people at high altitudes. The Denisovan variant modifies this response, allowing Tibetans to maintain normal hemoglobin concentrations despite the low oxygen environment. Instead of dangerous overproduction of red blood cells, Tibetans' bodies use available oxygen more efficiently, preventing the chronic mountain sickness that affects many non-Tibetans at high elevations. For Tibetan women, this adaptation proves crucial during pregnancy, when oxygen demands increase dramatically. While pregnancy at high altitudes often results in low birth weights and higher infant mortality among non-adapted populations, Tibetan women can successfully carry pregnancies without these complications. Genetic dating techniques suggest that the selective advantage was enormous. Those with the Denisovan version of EPS1 were significantly more likely to survive and reproduce. Computer models indicate that for such a variant to spread throughout a population in just 3,000 years, it must have increased survival rates by at least 10-20%, an extraordinarily strong selective pressure. Recent archaeological discoveries have found Denisovan remains in the Baishia Karst Cave on the Tibetan Plateau itself, located at 10,760 feet above sea level. This indicates Denisovans had already adapted to high-altitude living long before modern humans arrived, passing along genetic adaptations already tested by thousands of years of high-altitude living. Through cutting-edge genetic archaeology and modern sequencing techniques, scientists continue to unravel not just the Tibetan adaptation mystery, but also how these physiological differences manifest in everyday life at extreme altitudes, a bridge between our genetic past and the cultural practices that have developed alongside these biological advantages. Blood and breath, the biological paradox. This ancient Denisovan DNA doesn't just alter Tibetan genes. It completely reverses what should be a universal human physiological response. When most human bodies encounter oxygen-poor environments, they immediately implement emergency protocols that medical science long considered essential for survival. But Tibetans do the opposite, challenging decades of established medical understanding. For nearly a century, textbooks have described a predictable human response to high altitude. Your body senses the oxygen shortage and dramatically increases red blood cell production. This makes perfect sense at first glance. If each red blood cell carries oxygen, and you have less oxygen available, producing more cellular carriers should solve the problem. It's like adding more delivery trucks when demand increases. This protective mechanism kicks in rapidly when lowlanders ascend to altitude. Specialized cells in the kidneys detect low oxygen and release erythropoietin EPO, the same hormone that some athletes abuse as a performance enhancer. Within days, hematocrit levels can rise significantly as bone marrow accelerates red blood cell production. What begins as an elegant solution becomes problematic over time. Blood thickens like honey left in the cold as more red cells pack the bloodstream. This condition, polycythemia, creates severe health risks. High-altitude polycythemia is essentially a maladaptive response, explains Dr. Tatum Simonson, a physiologist at UCSD. Blood viscosity increases dramatically, forcing the heart to work harder to pump this thicker fluid through the circulatory system. The consequences can be severe. Thickened blood moves sluggishly through capillaries, reducing oxygen delivery to tissues. It increases blood pressure, strains the heart, and raises risks for stroke, heart attack, and blood clots. During pregnancy, this thick blood struggles to navigate the placenta's tiny vessels, contributing to higher rates of pregnancy complications among non-adapted women. Tibetan physiology defies this conventional wisdom. Despite living where oxygen pressure is roughly 40% lower than at sea level, most Tibetans maintain hemoglobin concentrations comparable to people living at sea level. Their bodies have rejected what medical science long considered the primary survival mechanism for high-altitude living. When we first measured hemoglobin levels in Tibetan populations, we had to recheck our equipment, recalls Dr. Cynthia Beale, an anthropologist who has studied high-altitude populations extensively. It contradicted everything in the literature. Here were people thriving at elevations where others developed serious polycythemia, yet their red blood cell counts were completely normal. Sonam, a Tibetan mother of 3 who lives at 14,000 feet, exemplifies this adaptation. The doctors from the university were surprised by my blood tests during pregnancy, she says. They told me women from lowland areas often struggle here, but my body knows this altitude. This counterintuitive adaptation creates a mystery. How do Tibetans get enough oxygen without extra carriers? The answer lies in a comprehensive redesign of their respiratory and circulatory systems. Tibetan lungs differ structurally from lowland lungs in several critical ways. They have approximately 20% greater lung volume relative to body size, with more extensive bronchial branching patterns, creating greater surface area for gas exchange. Even the density of alveoli, the tiny air sacs where oxygen transfers into the bloodstream, is notably higher. Tibetans take deeper, more efficient breaths, rather than the rapid, shallow breathing lowlanders develop at altitude. This breathing pattern maximizes oxygen intake while conserving energy. Respiratory measurements show Tibetans extract approximately 40% more oxygen from each breath compared to non-adapted individuals. Their circulatory system shows remarkable transformation. Tibetans have developed wider blood vessels and a more extensive capillary network. This expanded circulatory infrastructure improves blood flow efficiency and oxygen delivery to tissues despite lower red blood cell concentrations. Biochemically, Tibetan blood contains substantially higher concentrations of nitric oxide, a molecule that dilates blood vessels and facilitates oxygen transfer. while lowlanders typically produce less nitric oxide at high altitudes, contributing to blood vessel constriction. Tibetans produce more, another inversion of the standard response. The Tibetan pattern completely inverts the standard human response to hypoxia, explains Dr. Peter Robbins of Oxford University. Instead of increasing oxygen carriers in the blood, they've enhanced every other aspect of the oxygen transport chain, from inhalation to vessel architecture to cellular extraction mechanisms. These adaptations particularly benefit Tibetan women during pregnancy. Research shows Tibetan women experience almost double the uterine artery diameter increase during pregnancy compared to non-adapted populations. This expanded capacity, combined with lower blood viscosity, ensures adequate oxygen delivery to the developing fetus. At the cellular level, Tibetan tissues demonstrate enhanced efficiency in oxygen utilization. Their mitochondria, the cellular power plants, show modifications that allow optimal function under low oxygen conditions. This means Tibetan tissues maintain normal metabolic activity with less oxygen than lowlander cells require. The genetic mechanism enabling this comprehensive physiological redesign centers on the EPS1 gene inherited from Denisovans. This gene acts as a master regulator of the body's hypoxia response, controlling numerous processes including red blood cell production, blood vessel development, and cellular metabolism. The Denisovan variant reprograms these responses, preventing red blood cell overproduction while enhancing alternative adaptive pathways. It's as if the Tibetan genome contains a different instruction manual for responding to oxygen shortage, prioritizing efficiency over emergency measures. Dr. Joseph Prashal, a hematologist who has studied Tibetan blood characteristics extensively, describes it as an entirely different strategy for managing limited oxygen resources. Rather than hoarding oxygen through increased red cell mass, they've optimized its delivery and utilization throughout the system. This adaptation has profound implications. The Tibetan approach to oxygen management may offer insights into treating conditions like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, heart failure, and altitude sickness, as well as blood disorders characterized by overproduction of red blood cells. Agricultural innovation at the edge of possibility. Beyond their physiological adaptations, Tibetans faced an existential challenge that required equal ingenuity, finding ways to grow food in what agronomists consider nearly impossible conditions. While the human body can adapt to extract more oxygen from thin air, plants cannot evolve so quickly. The Tibetan Plateau presents a near-perfect storm of agricultural obstacles. Growing seasons shorter than 100 days, nighttime temperatures that routinely plunge below freezing even in summer months, and soil severely depleted of nutrients. A modern agronomist transported to the plateau would likely declare commercial agriculture impossible. Most staple crops require at least 120 frost-free days to reach maturity. In the highlands of Tibet, frost can occur during any month of the year, with the summer growing window often limited to just 90 days. The soil freezes solid for 8 months annually, preventing the decomposition and nutrient cycling that makes agriculture possible elsewhere. Water presents another paradox. Despite being the source region for Asia's major river systems, much of the plateau remains chronically water-stressed for agriculture. Precipitation arrives primarily as winter snow, with summer rains often coming in short, intense bursts that cause erosion. The thin atmosphere accelerates evaporation, quickly drying out fields unless water is carefully managed. Yet across this seemingly impossible landscape, Tibetan farmers cultivate nearly 2 million acres of crops annually, feeding millions of people. Their agricultural system represents one of humanity's most remarkable adaptations, cultural and technological rather than genetic. Consider Dorje, a farmer in the remote Changtang region. Like his ancestors, he constructs stone walls oriented east to west across his fields. These walls, often 2 to 3 feet high, absorb solar radiation during the day and radiate heat back to crops at night, raising temperatures enough to prevent frost damage during critical growing periods. The same walls disrupt the powerful winds that sweep down from higher elevations, creating sheltered zones where tender young plants can establish themselves. Field design itself represents centuries of environmental engineering. In the Shigatse Valley, farmers like Yangzum create small, irregular plots carefully positioned to capitalize on natural landscape features that offer protection. Her fields are slightly recessed below ground level, creating natural windbreaks and heat traps that raise ambient temperatures by several crucial degrees. The agricultural calendar reflects generations of precise observation. In Lesa's surrounding farmlands, Tenzin's family doesn't plant according to fixed dates, but watches for particular bird migrations, the emergence of certain insects, or the flowering of wild indicator plants that signal when soil temperatures have stabilized enough for specific crops. At the center of this agricultural system is highland barley that exists nowhere else on Earth. These specialized cultivars represent centuries of selective breeding for extreme conditions. They can germinate in much colder soil and complete their entire growth cycle with remarkable efficiency, maturing faster than lowland varieties. Most importantly, they can withstand brief freezes during flowering without significant yield loss, a physiological adaptation seldom seen in domesticated crops. Water management demonstrates equal sophistication. In the Yarlung Tsongpa Valley, farmers deploy intermittent irrigation, providing precisely timed, shallow flooding only during critical plant development stages. This reduces overall water usage by up to 60% compared to continuous irrigation methods. Some communities employ snow harvesting, placing stone walls or brush barriers that trap wind-blown snow during winter months, providing a slow-release water source that extends weeks beyond natural snowmelt. The fertility strategy represents another innovation born of necessity. Tibetan farmers developed a specialized approach to soil management centered around yak dung. This isn't simple manure spreading. The dung undergoes a specific preparation process where it's first dried, then partially combusted before field application. This converts nutrients into more readily available forms while creating a substance that retains moisture and improves soil texture in the harsh freeze-thaw cycles of the plateau. Fields receive this processed fertilizer in carefully calculated applications corresponding to specific growth stages of the barley, maximizing nutrient availability exactly when plants need it most. The polyculture system that has evolved on the plateau further demonstrates Tibetan agricultural wisdom. While barley forms the foundation, farmers interplant companion species that serve crucial ecological functions. Native leguminous plants are strategically positioned throughout barley fields, fixing atmospheric nitrogen in soils. Certain root crops are planted along field margins, their deep taproots breaking up compacted subsoil, while mining nutrients from deeper soil horizons otherwise inaccessible to shallow-rooted barley. The integration of agriculture with yak herding creates a closed-loop system that maximizes efficiency. Yaks convert inedible highland grasses into milk, meat, and wool while providing crucial fertilizer. After harvest, barley fields become temporary grazing areas where yaks consume crop residues while simultaneously preparing the soil for the next planting through their hooves' natural tillage effect. These integrated techniques have captured the attention of modern agricultural scientists. Recent research has identified Tibetan farming as a model of climate-resilient agriculture. Studies comparing traditional Tibetan methods with conventional modern techniques under similar conditions found the traditional approach produced more stable yields during extreme weather events, used significantly less water, and maintained soil fertility without synthetic inputs. The Tibetan agricultural system represents a sophisticated knowledge system that enables human survival in one of Earth's most challenging environments. The practices evolved over centuries through careful observation, experimentation, and intergenerational knowledge transfer, producing an agricultural approach perfectly calibrated to extract maximum productivity from a landscape that, by conventional standards, building should not support crops at all. While agricultural mastery allowed Tibetans to produce food in a seemingly impossible environment, an equally impressive innovation stands as their lasting monument to survival engineering: their architecture. That same harsh landscape that challenged Tibetan farmers presented an equally formidable architectural puzzle. How do you construct homes when wood is virtually non-existent, temperatures swing 60 degrees in a single day, and conventional building wisdom from lower elevations becomes useless, even potentially deadly. As evening settles over the plateau, traditional Tibetan homes transform into life-saving havens. The distinctive white-walled structures glow softly against the darkening landscape, their thick walls gradually releasing the day's stored heat as temperatures plummet outside. Inside, families gather in carefully positioned living spaces where warmth from below, both from animals on the ground floor and the day's captured sunlight, creates a cocoon of survivable temperatures while the outside world freezes. These buildings represent an architectural tradition perfectly calibrated to the extreme demands of high-altitude living, where shelter must do far more than merely keep out rain. Consider the fundamental challenges a Tibetan home must address. Most building sites sit above the tree line, where timber is almost non-existent. Wind speeds regularly exceed 60 miles per hour, stripping away heat through convection at alarming rates. Solar radiation arrives with extraordinary intensity during daylight hours, but disappears completely at night, creating daily temperature swings that would crack conventional materials. And perhaps most critically, any successful structure must maximize heat retention with zero external energy sources. Conventional architecture from temperate regions fails catastrophically under these conditions. Standard insulation materials don't exist locally. Glass windows create devastating heat loss at night. Pitched roofs increase surface area and accelerate heat loss. Building technologies dependent on manufactured materials are simply impossible without external supply chains. Just as nature tested their resilience, so too did their architects redesign the very shelter they call home. The traditional Tibetan solution begins with precise solar alignment, positioning the main facade within 15 degrees of true south to capture maximum solar radiation during winter months when the sun travels a lower arc across the sky. The buildings feature a distinctive trapezoidal profile with walls that slope inward at calculated angles. This shape provides structural stability against fierce winds, reduces cold northern exposures, and creates ideal angles for solar collection on south-facing surfaces. The structures appear to grow organically from the landscape rather than sitting upon it. The real genius lies in the walls themselves. Traditional hypoxia construction creates walls approximately 1 meter thick, mixing local soil with crushed stone in precise ratios determined by specific microclimatic conditions. This mixture is compacted between wooden forms using specialized tools to create optimal density. These walls function as thermal batteries, absorbing solar radiation during daylight and slowly releasing that heat throughout the night. Modern thermal imaging shows these walls maintain temperature differentials of up to 40 degrees between interior and exterior surfaces during winter nights. The earth-stone mixture provides ideal thermal mass properties for the plateau's particular temperature cycles. The exterior surfaces receive lime-based whitewash, refreshed annually in many communities. This striking visual feature serves critical functions. The high reflectivity helps regulate interior temperatures during intense summer sun while weatherproofing the structure. The lime content provides natural antimicrobial properties in a region where repair materials are precious. Windows follow asymmetrical placement dictated by solar patterns. South-facing walls feature larger openings positioned to capture maximum winter sunlight while minimizing summer heat gain. These windows traditionally use wooden frames with paper or animal skin coverings rather than glass, providing better insulation while allowing sufficient light transmission. The flat roofs serve multiple functions within this integrated system. Constructed using carefully layered materials, typically wooden beams overlaid with willow branches, then compacted earth mixed with straw. These roofs provide excellent insulation while creating valuable additional space. In summer, these surfaces become crucial work areas for drying agricultural products, efficiently utilizing the intense solar radiation. Traditional Tibetan homes incorporate specific spaces for livestock on the ground floor, with human living quarters above. This arrangement harnesses animal body heat as a supplementary heating system during winter months. The heat rises naturally through intermediary floors, warming living spaces without requiring additional fuel. Modern analysis shows this biological heating can raise ambient temperatures by 5 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, the difference between survival and hypothermia during harsh months. Interior layouts follow deliberate patterns optimized for heat circulation. The central hearth area burns limited fuels, primarily dried yak dung, with maximum efficiency. Surrounding this heat source, living spaces are arranged in concentric zones of thermal priority, with sleeping and frequently used spaces positioned to capture rising heat, while storage areas serve as insulation buffers along northern exposures. The scientific principles underlying these architectural strategies were only formally understood by Western physics in the 20th century. Yet Tibetan builders incorporated them through generational knowledge transfer and observation. Modern sustainability researchers now study these structures as models of passive solar design, noting their remarkable thermal efficiency without mechanical systems. Recent studies by architectural researchers from ETH Zurich documented that traditional Tibetan structures maintain interior temperatures between 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit even when exterior temperatures drop below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, all without supplemental heating beyond occasional cooking fires and animal heat. This performance exceeds many modern buildings despite using no commercial insulation, mechanical ventilation, or external energy inputs. The knowledge embedded in these building traditions represents a sophisticated understanding of architectural physics developed through centuries of empirical testing. Construction methods were refined through a process similar to natural selection. Innovations that improved thermal performance were retained and spread throughout communities, while less effective techniques disappeared. Weather wisdom, traditional knowledge systems. The same evolutionary process that perfected Tibetan architecture also shaped another survival system equally invisible to outsiders, a weather prediction method so precise it can detect storms modern satellites sometimes miss. How does a herder with no formal education consistently forecast deadly weather that can materialize in minutes on the world's highest plateau? On the Tibetan Plateau, weather isn't simply an inconvenience. It's a matter of life and death. A sudden blizzard can trap herders miles from shelter, and lightning strikes on these exposed highlands kill hundreds of yaks annually. Hailstorms capable of destroying an entire season's crops can form in under 30 minutes, sometimes with stones large enough to cause fatal injuries to both livestock and humans caught in the open. What makes these weather phenomena particularly dangerous is their localized nature and rapid formation. The complex topography of valleys, ridges, and peaks creates microclimatic pockets where conditions can vary dramatically within just a few miles. Western meteorological models struggle with this terrain, often failing to predict these highly localized events even with modern satellite and radar systems. For centuries, Tibetans have relied instead on an intricate indigenous forecasting system. This knowledge framework integrates observations of cloud morphology, wind patterns, animal behavior, and celestial positioning into a comprehensive prediction methodology that functions without instruments. While modern weather stations in Tibet often issue forecasts with a 48-hour outlook, traditional Tibetan weather readers can detect specific storm patterns up to 3 days before they materialize. Dorje, a 73-year-old herder, demonstrated this life-saving knowledge when he urgently gathered his family's yaks into a protected valley despite clear morning skies. 6 hours later, a devastating hailstorm struck the neighboring ridge where the herd would have been grazing. When asked how he knew, he pointed to subtle cloud formations that modern instruments had missed entirely. Central to this system is an extraordinarily nuanced classification of cloud formations. Tibetan herders recognize distinctive types specifically associated with the plateau's atmospheric conditions. The appearance of Rulung Sprin, thin, streaky clouds that seem to be combed by invisible fingers, signals increasing wind speeds within the next 12 hours. Most remarkable is the Ka-Thor Formation, a pattern that appears over certain sacred mountains only 48 to 72 hours before major storms. Chinese meteorologists confirmed in 2015 that these formations correlate with barometric pressure drops that indeed precede major storm systems with remarkable consistency. The Tibetan language has evolved to encode these weather patterns with extraordinary precision. Linguists have documented over 120 words for different snow and precipitation types, each conveying specific information about temperature, moisture content, and danger. Level. Serbier describes a particular type of hail forming when warm air masses collide with cold fronts at specific elevations, while Gangsredal refers to the fine, powdery snow that signals the most dangerous blizzard conditions. This weather reading ability extends beyond atmospheric observations. Tibetan herders carefully observe native wildlife behaviors, particularly the movements of the Tibetan snowcock and black-neck crane. Research published in the Journal of Ethnobiology documented how these birds alter their feeding patterns 24 to 48 hours before major weather shifts in ways that correlate with barometric pressure changes too subtle for humans to perceive directly. Indigenous knowledge also incorporates plant responses as predictive tools. The Tibetan Edelweiss flower closes in response to humidity changes that precede storms, while the angle of drooping juniper branches indicates precipitation probability. These biological barometers respond to environmental signals humans cannot directly perceive, like reading nature's own warning system written in living ink. The transmission of this knowledge follows a structured apprenticeship. Young Tibetans begin learning basic cloud classifications around age 6. By adolescence, they recognize dozens of specific formations and their weather implications. This educational approach uses specialized memory techniques, including songs that encode cloud sequences and corresponding weather patterns. The accuracy of this traditional forecasting attracted scientific attention when Chinese meteorological researchers established a 5-year comparative study between traditional Tibetan weather readers and modern forecasting stations. Traditional forecasters achieved 70% accuracy for 72-hour predictions of major weather events, compared to 65% accuracy for conventional meteorological approaches. For localized severe weather, traditional methods proved even more reliable. 87% accuracy in predicting sudden storms within specific valleys, compared to just 62% for instrument-based systems. What makes this knowledge particularly valuable is its hyperlocalization. While a modern weather station might issue a general storm warning for an entire region, Tibetan weather readers can predict which specific valleys will experience the worst conditions based on subtle differences in cloud formations over different peaks. This precision allows herders to move livestock to safer areas and farmers to protect vulnerable crops before storms arrive. The China Meteorological Administration now employs traditional weather readers as consultants at several Tibetan weather stations. These indigenous experts work alongside meteorologists with advanced degrees, combining traditional observation with modern instrumentation to create more accurate forecasting models for the Plateau region. Tenzin Nyama, who has worked with meteorologists for over 15 years, demonstrates this integration of knowledge systems. Scientific validation confirmed his ability to predict major storms within a 3-hour window based entirely on visual observation. Researchers found he was responding to barometric pressure changes as small as 2 millibars, beyond the conscious perception threshold of most humans. This integration represents how indigenous wisdom can complement contemporary approaches. Meteorologists now recognize that satellite imagery cannot capture the complex interplay of microclimate conditions that Tibetan observers have learned to read through generations of careful observation. The most profound aspect of this traditional system is its embedded understanding of pattern recognition across multiple environmental indicators. Tibetan weather prediction integrates observations across atmospheric, zoological, and botanical domains, creating a comprehensive analytical framework that processes environmental information holistically rather than in isolation. Medicinal mastery, healing at high altitude. Beyond predicting deadly weather, surviving on the roof of the world requires mastering another invisible system, the human body itself. At altitudes where oxygen saturation drops by nearly half and UV radiation intensifies by 40%, even minor injuries or illnesses can quickly become fatal without intervention. Yet Tibetans have thrived for centuries with minimal outside medical support, developing one of the world's oldest continuously practiced medical traditions. The Tibetan Plateau presents unique medical challenges beyond those created by oxygen scarcity. The intense ultraviolet radiation at high altitudes damages skin and eyes at rates far exceeding those at lower elevations. Burns heal more slowly due to reduced oxygen availability to tissues. Minor cuts risk severe infection when the nearest antibiotics might be days away by horseback. Winter respiratory infections that would be manageable at sea level can rapidly escalate into life-threatening pneumonia when the immune system is already stressed by altitude. These conditions created a medical imperative: develop local solutions or perish. The result is the Soa Rigpa medical system, a sophisticated healing tradition dating back over 1,200 years. While neighboring medical systems like traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurveda influenced its early development, Tibetan medicine evolved distinct approaches specifically calibrated to high-altitude conditions. At the heart of this system lies an extensive pharmacopoeia built around plants that exist nowhere else on Earth. The unique environmental pressures of the plateau have forced these plants to develop defensive compounds not found in lowland species. Many contain unusually high concentrations of antioxidants, anti-inflammatory agents, and oxygen efficiency promoters that help them survive where other plants cannot. This botanical treasure trove has been meticulously documented since the 8th century, when the foundational medical text, the Four Tantras, Gyaji, was compiled. Modern analysis has identified more than 3,000 medicinal substances used in traditional Tibetan medicine, approximately 2,000 plant species, 150 animal-derived substances, and 100 minerals. Many of these plants produce compounds specifically beneficial for addressing high-altitude medical conditions. Rhodiola crenulata, known locally as Hongjing Tian, grows between 11,000 and 18,000 feet elevation and produces salidroside compounds that increase oxygen utilization efficiency in human cells. Tibetan doctors prescribe it for altitude-related fatigue and weakness. Modern research confirms it improves cellular oxygen metabolism at high elevations. The snow lotus Sausuria laniceps, growing only above 18,000 feet, contains anti-inflammatory compounds that target pulmonary inflammation, precisely the kind that threatens survival at high altitude. Cordyceps sinensis, the caterpillar fungus found only on the plateau, has been treasured for centuries for treating respiratory weaknesses and has been validated by research to increase maximum oxygen uptake. Dorje, a nomadic herder from Nagchu, experienced this tradition's life-saving potential firsthand. While tending yaks at 17,000 feet, he developed severe respiratory distress, likely early-stage pulmonary edema. 3 days from the nearest hospital, his family summoned a local traditional doctor who diagnosed his condition through pulse reading and administered a complex herbal formula containing snow lotus and cordyceps. By morning, his breathing had stabilized enough to travel. "The old medicine bought me time," Dorje later explained. "Without it, I wouldn't have survived long enough to reach modern care." What makes Tibetan medicinal knowledge particularly impressive is its systematic approach. Plants are harvested according to precise schedules based on growth cycles, altitude, aspect, and lunar phases, all factors now known to affect the concentration of bioactive compounds. The Tibetan calendar specifies that certain roots should only be harvested during the waning moon in early autumn, when their medicinal potency peaks. Equally sophisticated is Tibetan diagnostic methodology. While pulse reading exists in several Asian medical traditions, Tibetan physicians develop specific techniques to detect subtle circulation changes induced by altitude stress. By carefully feeling 12 distinct pulse points across both wrists, trained practitioners can identify variations in blood flow patterns that signal impending altitude sickness before external symptoms appear. The accuracy of these diagnostics impressed Western researchers who conducted blind comparison studies in 2018. Tibetan physicians correctly identified early-stage, high-altitude pulmonary edema in 83% of cases based solely on pulse diagnosis, before patients showed clinical symptoms and before equipment-based diagnostics could detect the condition. This medical tradition hasn't remained static. Modern antibiotics are now incorporated alongside traditional treatments. At the Tibetan Medicine Hospital in Lhasa, traditional physicians work alongside conventionally trained doctors, developing integrated treatment plans that combine pharmaceutical interventions with traditional medicines. This integration has yielded remarkable results for high-altitude specific conditions. For acute mountain sickness, the combined protocol of oxygen therapy plus traditional Tibetan herbal compounds reduces recovery time by approximately 40% compared to oxygen alone in controlled studies. These successes have attracted international pharmaceutical interest. Research institutes in Europe, China, and the United States have established programs to investigate Tibetan medicinal plants. Some compounds isolated represent entirely new chemical classes not previously known to science, with specialized properties that allow them to cross barriers more effectively than existing drugs. The tradition recognizes the body's need for different interventions at different altitudes. Traditional doctors prescribe specific formulations for travelers ascending to the plateau, different ones for those experiencing acute symptoms, and others for long-term adaptation support. This altitude-specific approach predated modern understanding of stage-based altitude illness by centuries. Today, this ancient tradition is undergoing a renaissance. The Ment Sikang Tibetan Medical and Astrological Institute combines traditional apprenticeship with contemporary scientific training. Students learn both classical diagnostic methods and modern laboratory techniques, ensuring the tradition evolves rather than fossilizes. The medical innovations developed through centuries of Tibetan practice, altitude-specific remedies, pulse-based early diagnostics, and staged treatment protocols, now provide valuable foundations for modern pharmaceutical research, demonstrating how ancient wisdom continues to inform cutting-edge science in our understanding of how human bodies adapt to extreme environments. Nutritional adaptation, the high-altitude diet. From medicine cabinets to kitchen shelves, Tibetan survival knowledge extends beyond herbal remedies to the daily menu. When your body requires nearly double the calories, but you live in one of Earth's most food-scarce environments, what you eat becomes as crucial as what medicines you take. The Tibetan solution? A dietary system so precisely calibrated for high-altitude survival that NASA scientists are now studying it. At extreme elevations, the human body faces a metabolic paradox. Cold temperatures trigger increased calorie burning to maintain core temperature, while simultaneously the reduced oxygen availability makes efficient energy production more difficult. Research conducted at the University of Copenhagen found that inhabitants of high-altitude regions require between 35 to 42% more caloric intake than those at sea level, simply to maintain basic bodily functions. This nutritional challenge is compounded by the harsh reality of food production on the plateau. With minimal arable land and a punishing climate, Tibetans have access to only a fraction of the food diversity found in lowland regions. A dietary survey conducted across 28 Tibetan communities revealed that just 6 primary food sources account for approximately 85% of all caloric intake, a remarkably limited nutritional palette compared to the 30-plus staple foods common in most human diets. Yet from these constraints emerged one of humanity's most metabolically efficient dietary systems. At the center of traditional Tibetan nutrition is tsampa, roasted barley flour that serves as the cornerstone of daily consumption. Unlike white rice or wheat flour that rapidly converts to blood sugar, tsampa offers a complex carbohydrate profile that releases energy gradually. Laboratory analysis reveals tsampa contains a unique ratio of amylose to amylopectin starches, approximately 30 to 70, that provides sustained energy release over 4 to 6 hours, perfectly suited for the body's heightened metabolic demands at altitude. The Tibetan approach to dietary fat challenges conventional Western nutritional guidelines. Tibetans consume approximately 40 to 50% of their calories from fat sources, primarily through their distinctive butter tea. This approach represents sophisticated metabolic engineering for high-altitude survival. The Tibetan diet runs counter to conventional nutritional wisdom, but makes perfect sense when you understand the specific metabolic demands of high-altitude living, explains Dr. Andrew Murray, physiologist at the University of Cambridge who studied dietary adaptations among high-altitude populations. Fat provides more than twice the energy per gram compared to carbohydrates or protein, but crucially for high-altitude environments, requires approximately 15% less oxygen to metabolize. The butter used in Tibetan tea comes specifically from female yaks, technically called DRI, whose milk contains approximately 6 to 8% butterfat, significantly higher than the 3.5% found in typical dairy cow milk. This butter undergoes a unique preparation process where it's churned, heated, and often aged for weeks or months before being combined with black tea and salt. The first sip of butter tea delivers a rich, velvety warmth that coats the mouth with a subtle saltiness and nutty undertones. The sensation of concentrated energy flowing through the body as the steaming liquid slides down your throat in the thin mountain air. The tea preparation process itself reveals another layer of nutritional sophistication. The typical brewing method involves boiling tea leaves for extended periods, which releases significantly higher concentrations of catechins and theanine compounds than quick steep methods used elsewhere. These compounds help optimize fat metabolism while providing mild bronchodilation effects, essentially helping Tibetans process the high fat content while slightly expanding airways for improved oxygen uptake. Protein needs in this environment present another challenge that Tibetans have ingeniously solved. With limited access to fresh meat, they developed shamdo, strips of yak meat air-dried in the ultraviolet intensive sunlight. Unlike simple dehydration, this process triggers partial protein denaturation that significantly increases digestibility, with studies showing approximately 23% higher protein bioavailability from the preserved form. Equally important are the fermentation practices developed to maximize nutritional extraction from limited resources. While the ground lies frozen and barren outside, inside Tibetan homes, helpful bacteria transforms simple ingredients into nutritional powerhouses. Chugo, a fermented cheese product, undergoes bacterial transformation that predigests milk proteins and increases calcium bioavailability by approximately 35% compared to unfermented dairy. Similarly, the fermentation of barley into chang, a mild alcoholic beverage, creates B vitamins that would otherwise be absent from the diet. Modern nutritional science has begun formally validating what Tibetans discovered through generations of dietary evolution. Researchers at University College London analyzed the macronutrient composition of traditional Tibetan meals, finding they contain precisely calibrated ratios that maximize metabolic efficiency in hypoxic conditions. The Tibetan diet changes seasonally to address fluctuating metabolic needs. During winter months, butter consumption increases by approximately 30%, providing additional insulation through brown fat activation. Conversely, summer diets incorporate more fermented foods containing natural vasodilators that help regulate body temperature during warmer periods. Even the serving vessels themselves reflect nutritional insight. The traditional wooden tea bowls provide natural insulation that keeps butter tea at the ideal drinking temperature of 120 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to maintain fat solubility, but cool enough to prevent damage to beneficial compounds. These dietary practices have captured the attention of space agencies studying how humans might survive in extraterrestrial environments. NASA's Advanced Food Technology Project has begun analyzing Tibetan preservation methods and macronutrient ratios as potential models for developing space mission nutrition systems. The emphasis on caloric density, nutrient stability, and oxygen-efficient metabolism aligns perfectly with the challenges of feeding astronauts in the resource-constrained environment of deep space. The traditional Tibetan diet solves many of the same nutritional challenges we face in planning long-duration space missions, notes Dr. Grace Douglas, lead scientist for NASA's Advanced Food Technology Research. High caloric density, efficient oxygen utilization, and stable preservation methods are exactly what we beyond need Earth for extended from missions beyond Mars. Earth. The connection between Tibetan adaptations and space exploration extends far beyond food systems. When astronauts step onto the Martian surface, they'll face an environment with striking similarities to the Tibetan Plateau, where humans have already developed solutions to survive precisely these conditions for thousands of years. Could the answers to surviving on another planet already exist here on Earth? Mars presents what NASA calls the triple threat to human survival. Atmospheric pressure at just 0.6% of Earth's, temperatures ranging from 70 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 195 degrees Fahrenheit, and radiation levels that would quickly prove fatal without protection. These conditions mirror, albeit in more extreme form, the challenges Tibetans have adapted to overcome through generations of physiological and cultural evolution. Dr. June Park, lead researcher at NASA's Human Adaptation Research Division, explains the significance of this natural parallel. The Tibetan experience represents a natural laboratory for understanding human adaptation to environments remarkably similar to what we'll face on Mars. We're examining their entire adaptive system, from cellular responses to cultural practices. In 2019, NASA launched the High-Altitude Human Adaptation Study, HAHAS, partnering with research institutions across the Tibetan Plateau. This unprecedented project moves beyond previous research on individual adaptations to create a comprehensive blueprint for human survival in Mars-like conditions. What makes the Tibetan model so valuable is that it's a complete system, notes Dr. Park, highlighting the holistic approach needed for space exploration. It addresses the interconnected challenges of low oxygen, temperature extremes, and resource limitations simultaneously. That's exactly what we need for Mars. The most promising area of research focuses on the oxygen utilization efficiency that Tibetans have developed. Mars astronauts will face chronic hypoxia even within pressurized habitats, as engineering limitations make it impossible to fully replicate Earth's atmosphere. Studies at the International Space Station have documented a consistent 30% reduction in exercise capacity and subtle cognitive impairment in astronauts, similar to what lowlanders experience at high altitudes. Geneticist Dr. Melissa Connor from a European Space Agency's Astrobiology Unit explains the physiological advantages Tibetans possess. Tibetans solved this problem through a cascade of physiological adaptations that we're only beginning to understand. Their mitochondria, the cellular powerhouses, extract energy from oxygen with approximately 30% greater efficiency than lowlanders. This revelation has prompted a radical shift in space medicine. Rather than focusing exclusively on oxygen delivery systems, researchers are exploring how to enhance human cellular oxygen utilization, a strategy directly inspired by Tibetan physiology. We're developing compounds that mimic the effects of the EPS1 variant without requiring genetic modification, says Dr. Connor. Early tests show a 15% improvement in oxygen utilization efficiency in non-adapted subjects. That could be the difference between functional astronauts and impaired ones during a Mars mission. Beyond physiology, Mars habitat design increasingly incorporates principles from traditional Tibetan architecture. The trapezoidal profile and southern orientation of Tibetan homes have directly influenced the baseline designs for Mars surface habitats in both NASA and SpaceX development programs. Hiroshi Yamamoto, lead architect for NASA's Mars Habitat Design Group, explains how ancient wisdom offers modern solutions. The thermal mass principles employed in Tibetan construction solve exactly the problem we face on Mars: dramatic temperature fluctuations with minimal energy inputs. We've digitized traditional Tibetan building techniques and run them through advanced thermal modeling software. The results are remarkable. These primitive techniques outperform many of our high-tech solutions. Mars habitat prototypes tested in the Utah desert now incorporate rammed earth construction techniques directly adapted from Tibetan methods. The walls, composed of Martian soil simulant mixed with binding agents in ratios similar to traditional hypoxia, maintain interior temperatures within a 15-degree range despite external fluctuations exceeding 100 degrees, all without active heating or cooling systems. Tibetan agricultural strategies are also informing Mars food production systems. The companion planting techniques developed on the plateau have been adapted for use in controlled environment agriculture experiments conducted by the Mars Society. The Tibetan farming calendar, which maximizes productivity in a brutally short growing season, offers a blueprint for optimizing plant growth cycles with minimal resources explains Dr. Sarah Johnson, botanist with NASA's Advanced Food Production Systems team. We've adapted these techniques for our Mars greenhouses and seen yield increases of up to 40% compared to conventional hydroponics, while reducing water and nutrient inputs by nearly a third. These agricultural methods serve a dual purpose in Mars mission planning, producing food while supporting psychological well-being during long-duration missions. Studies show that crews engaging in adapted Tibetan farming practices report significantly lower stress levels and improved team cohesion compared to groups using fully automated systems. Even meditation practices of Tibetan monks are being studied for space applications. These abilities, once dismissed as mystical claims, have been documented using functional MRI and metabolic monitoring. Advanced meditators can reduce their oxygen consumption by up to 64% while maintaining cognitive performance, explains Dr. Elizabeth Chen, neuropsychologist at the European Astronaut Center. That's a more significant reduction than any pharmacological intervention we've developed. We're now incorporating modified Tibetan meditation protocols into astronaut training programs. NASA's mission control procedures are also being influenced by Tibetan weather prediction methods. The pattern recognition approaches used by traditional forecasters are informing new artificial intelligence systems designed to anticipate and respond to emergent problems during Mars missions. As these research directions converge, the space science community has begun referring to the Tibetan model of adaptation as a comprehensive framework for human survival beyond Earth. What began as narrow studies of genetic adaptations has expanded into recognition of a sophisticated, integrated survival system developed over generations of human experience in Mars-like conditions. The people of the Tibetan Plateau have already solved problems we're just beginning to understand, reflects Dr. Park. They've developed a blueprint for human survival in environments we once considered uninhabitable. As we look toward Mars and beyond, their example reminds us that the answers we seek might already exist in human experience. The Adaptation Timeline, Evolution in Fast Forward. This blueprint for survival didn't develop over millions of years as conventional evolutionary theory might suggest. In fact, the speed at which Tibetans adapted to their extreme environment challenges are fundamental understanding of human evolution. What science once considered impossible, significant physiological transformation within a handful of generations, appears to be precisely what happened on the Tibetan Plateau. For most of scientific history, researchers believed meaningful evolutionary adaptations required vast stretches of time. The standard evolutionary model suggested that significant physiological changes typically needed 50,000 to 100,000 years, or roughly 2,000 to 4,000 generations, to become established in a population. This timeline seemed logical given the gradual nature of genetic mutation and selection. The textbooks I studied as a graduate student all emphasized the same principle, that major physiological adaptations require geological timescales, explains Dr. Anna Peterson, evolutionary biologist at Oxford University. We were taught that meaningful biological adaptations to extreme environments would take tens of thousands of years at minimum. The Tibetan case forces us to reconsider that fundamental assumption. When researchers began analyzing the genetic timeline of Tibetan adaptation, they discovered something remarkable. Using molecular dating techniques that examine mutation rates in DNA, scientists determined that the beneficial Denisovan variant of the EPS1 gene spread through the Tibetan population in approximately 3,000 years. This represents just 120 generations, a mere evolutionary blink of an eye. Genetic anthropologist Dr. Marcus Chun from Stanford University has spent the last decade studying the rapid spread of adaptive genes in human populations. The selection pressure for the Denisovan EPS1 variant in Tibetans ranks among the strongest ever documented in humans, he notes. Our models suggest individuals carrying this gene variant had a survival advantage of at least 20% per generation. That's an astonishing selective coefficient. To put this in perspective, the lactase persistence mutation that allows adults to digest milk spread through European populations with a selective advantage of approximately 5 to 10% per generation. The Tibetan adaptation occurred at least twice as rapidly. Think of evolution like a relay race. While most genetic changes pass the baton at a steady marathon pace, Tibetan adaptations sprinted forward with unprecedented speed. Beyond the EPAS1 gene, researchers have identified at least 30 other genetic modifications that appear to have spread through the Tibetan population during this same compressed timeframe. These genes affect everything from blood vessel formation to metabolic efficiency. What we're seeing is a coordinated suite of genetic modifications that transformed multiple body systems simultaneously, explains Dr. Elise Wong, a human physiologist specializing in high-altitude adaptation. The conventional wisdom was that such comprehensive physiological remodeling would require at least 50,000 years. The Tibetan timeline compresses that by an order of magnitude. The extreme selective pressure of the Tibetan environment drove this evolutionary sprint. At elevations where oxygen levels are insufficient to support normal human physiology, the stakes of adaptation were literally life or death. Those without beneficial genetic variants faced severe health consequences, including higher infant mortality, maternal death during pregnancy, and reduced reproductive success. Mathematical modeling by population geneticists suggests that selection coefficients for Tibetan adaptations may have reached 25 to 30% per generation during periods of environmental stress, such as harsh winters or droughts. When selection pressure is this intense, evolution can proceed far more rapidly than we previously understood, notes Dr. Chun. The Tibetan case demonstrates that under sufficient environmental pressure, human physiology can transform drastically within just a few millennia. This accelerated timeline has profound implications for our understanding of human evolutionary potential. The Tibetan example suggests our species possesses a remarkable degree of adaptive plasticity that can be activated under intense selective pressure. Dr. Jared Williams, director of the Human Adaptation Research Institute, frames it this way. For decades, we've underestimated the speed at which our species can transform itself when survival demands it. The Tibetan timelines suggest humans may be capable of adapting to new environmental challenges much more rapidly than previously thought, perhaps within just a few thousand years rather than tens of thousands. This revised understanding has sparked intense interest from researchers studying how humans might respond to current and future environmental changes. Climate scientists and evolutionary biologists are now collaborating to model how populations might physiologically adapt to rising temperatures, changing disease patterns, and altered food supplies. The Tibetan example gives us reason for cautious optimism about human adaptive capacity, explains Dr. Sarah Henderson, who studies adaptation to climate change at the University of California. While we shouldn't expect genetic solutions to all environmental challenges, the speed of Tibetan adaptation suggests our species may have more biological resilience than we previously recognized. The implications extend to humanity's potential future beyond Earth. Researchers at space agencies are studying the Tibetan adaptation timeline to understand how rapidly humans might adapt to extraterrestrial environments. If meaningful physiological adaptations can occur within 120 generations on Earth, similar time frames might apply to potential human colonies on Mars. The Tibetan case also challenges conventional views on evolution itself. What we're seeing is more consistent with a punctuated equilibrium model rather than gradual change, notes Dr. Wong. The Tibetan timeline indicates that human evolution can experience periods of relative stasis followed by rapid transformation when environmental conditions demand it. This understanding extends to cultural adaptation as well. The accelerated genetic changes in Tibetans were complemented by equally rapid cultural innovations, from architectural techniques to specialized agricultural practices, all developed within the same compressed time frame. The Tibetan example demonstrates that biological and cultural adaptation can proceed in tandem, explains Dr. Williams. Genetic adaptations provided the physiological foundation for survival, while cultural innovations maximize the adaptive advantage those genetic changes conferred. Understanding how Tibetans adapted their oxygen management systems could inform treatments for conditions like chronic pulmonary disease, sleep apnea, and altitude sickness. If human physiology can transform so dramatically within a compressed evolutionary timeframe, similar plasticity might be activated therapeutically. As we look back at the remarkable journey of adaptation on the Tibetan Plateau, we see not just a story of survival, but a revelation about our species itself. The boundaries of what humans can achieve have been continuously redrawn throughout history. The Tibetan case dramatically demonstrates our adaptive capacity, challenging fundamental assumptions about human limitations. What might this mean for our future? As we face climate change and dream of distant worlds, the Tibetan example reminds us that adaptation is embedded in our DNA. Their story invites us to wonder what's seemingly impossible. Frontiers, might our children's children one day call home?